Hello, welcome to Global Eye. Leaders of 8 nations, including India, China, Russia and Pakistan, gathered in Samarkand city of Uzbekistan for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. This is the first meeting of the SCO members after the pandemic. This is also the first time when Prime Minister Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping came face-to-face after the deadly border clashes in 2020. It was also the first time for Russia and China to hold bilateral talks since the Ukraine invasion. China said it will work together with Russia to become great global powers and inject stability and positive energy into a chaotic world. The Russian president thanked China for taking a balanced approach on the Ukraine invasion. Speaking at the summit, Prime Minister Modi said he wants to transform India into a manufacturing hub. There was no bilateral between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. However, China supported India as a host country for next year's SCO Summit. We're now joined by Ambassador K.C. Singh, former diplomat and strategic affairs expert, Brahma Chellaney also with us, and we have with us Ash Jain from the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Brahma Chellaney, if I can begin with you, give us a sense of how you read the big message coming from the SCO Summit, especially from the meeting between President Putin and President Xi. China saying that it wants to make great efforts with Russia to play the role of great powers in guiding the world in this chaotic atmosphere. The big message coming from the Putin-Xi meeting first.
I think the Xi Jinping-Putin meeting underscores the new global divide, a new global divide between the Western Bloc and the China-Russia axis. In fact, the SCO symbolizes the China-Russia axis. These two countries were the founders of the SCO, though China increasingly has been in the SCO's driving seat. The SCO itself is a very unusual organization. It's a club of autocracies, with India being the sole exception. India is the only established democracy in the SCO. India, therefore, lends value to the SCO. But to answer your question, the big takeaway from the SCO Summit is that the China-Russia axis may look solid, but it's actually not that solid, because China is seeking to pursue its own narrow interests. It's seeking to build energy security by taking advantage of the fact that Russia is diminishing its gas supplies to Europe, and Europe is cutting off oil imports from Russia, and that allows China to build an energy safety net that will not be subject in any war scenario, a Taiwan war crisis, subject to a US interdiction. So for China, Russia's troubles are good news to enhance its own economic and military power. And as far as India is concerned in this bigger picture, India wants to serve as a bridge in the new global divide, rather than getting squeezed by both sides. But one can argue that India is already facing a squeeze from both camps. China, as you know, has stepped up military pressure on India, and the US is returning to rearming Pakistan, as highlighted by the New Deal to modernize Pakistan's F-16 fleet.
Right. Let me get in Ash Jain. Ash, how do you see messages coming from Putin and Xi? Putin went on to say that there are now new centers of power which cooperate with each other. So how do you see statements coming from Putin and President Xi?
Yeah, well, it's been interesting to watch the developments between Putin and Xi Jinping at the summit. Clearly, Putin, in his opening remarks, suggested that there were some differences, particularly between the Chinese and Russian views on Ukraine. He said that he sees and understands that China has some concerns. This was a surprising admission coming from Putin, who wants to project sort of solidarity with China. But the overall message, I think the overall symbolism of the meeting, the fact that the Chinese and the Russian leaders have come together in this setting, suggests that they continue to support each other with their broader global agenda, pushing back on the West, pushing back on the US-led international order, they see that they're trying to create a kind of club that makes the world safe for their autocratic systems of government. And what we saw in the larger messaging and the fact that this was Xi Jinping's first visit outside of China since COVID began, a visit that made clear that he wants to stand together and show the world that China and Russia and the other Central Asian states are acting in one voice, in one setting, in terms of looking at the challenges facing the global order. Now, India's participation in this summit is another story, and it's clear from the Russian and Chinese perspective that they would like to engage a broader grouping that includes India and others as they stand up to and project this kind of anti-Western global vision. India itself is a little bit of a misfit as a long-standing democracy in this club.
Right. Let me get an Ambassador K.C. Singh. Ambassador K.C. Singh, in the past as well, Russia and China have spoken about their friendship. They have gone on to say that they hope that this partnership will be an example for international relations across the world. Do you think the closeness, the proximity of the two leaders, of the two countries at the SCO Summit, was symbolism limited to the SCO Summit, or is there a larger significance for the evolving global order as a result of their statements?
Well, firstly, look at the difference between the language used in Beijing at the end of the Olympics there, where they talked of no limits partnership. And this is before Russia opened its Ukraine campaign. So there the Chinese were looking at a much broader engagement with Russia in terms of the context then existing. So convergence was taking place. The Chinese, as Mr. Chellaney has put it, were looking for energy security, and that was being provided by Russia turning away from the West and diversifying, and therefore reaching out to Chinese and supplying the energy. There's a new pipeline, which is a gas pipeline, which is coming up, which now gains even more importance when Nord Stream, etc., are becoming dysfunctional or non-functional. Particularly after December, if Europe is going to scale back completely, then the Russians need new markets. And therefore, China provides an immediate market. Now, the question is, what is India doing? It's always known that the focus would be on Xi Jinping as well as Vladimir Putin, because that's what the world was watching to see. Is it still a no-limits partnership, or it's a conditional partnership? Now, it appears it's a more conditional partnership. China does not want to hazard its relationship with the West. So far has not supplied military equipment, probably is not prepared to. It's willing to give financial assistance indirectly by buying Russian gas and therefore keeping the Russians supplied with foreign exchange. But India comes in because we are the next chair, and therefore the Prime Minister had to be there. And then we'll be able to control the agenda. But even now, the agenda which the Uzbek president had in mind was more energy security, food security. And there seems to be little attention paid to that. All the focus has gone on China and Russia. Now, as far as India is concerned, Prime Minister is talking of India as an innovation hub, supply chain diversification, resilience. Now, how are you going to have supply chain resilience if your relationship with Pakistan is not normal? You know, if Article 370 abrogation is going to upend your relationship with Pakistan to the extent that you can't even meet or the Prime Minister doesn't want to, the two Prime Ministers can't meet the Prime Ministers of India and Pakistan, how are you going to open up the space to India's West? Because Pakistan will not allow you access to Central Asia. You can go via Chabahar and Iran, but certainly Pakistan is not going to open it. And the shortest route is always going to be this way. So therefore, we can talk of resilience, talk of linkages to Central Asia. I don't think they are investment-rich countries in Central Asia who are going to be bringing investment in. So in a sense, there is a slight disconnect between Prime Minister's message and what SCO is all about. SCO was always about security. It was founded 3 months before 9/11. And therefore, it was the concern from Taliban control of Afghanistan which created this, the birth of SCO. And then it has focused on terrorism, on drugs coming out of Afghanistan. But post-2001, when the Americans arrived in Afghanistan, in Kabul, and a West American-friendly government took over, The Chinese then brought in their Belt and Road and expanding the network, and therefore talking of infrastructure diversification. So are we on the same page as the Chinese when we talk about it? No, because the Chinese are looking at CPEC, their communication to the Indian Ocean going through Pakistan, whereas that is not available to you. You are not going to be linked into that. You have shown some interest, but that's not going to work for you. Or they're linked through Central Asia to Europe and the Gulf.
All right.
So the focus is going there. So where does India fit into it? I don't know. As long as we don't normalize relations with China and Pakistan.
Right. So that's an important message. And one of our panelists also said earlier that India was probably a misfit in this setting. Here, the entire focus was on Putin and Xi Jinping, and India, of course, and the Prime Minister making this point about food security, also about how they can help the world with their own startup story as well. But let me get Brahma Chellaney once again. Brahma Chellaney, there was a lot of conversation, a lot of speculation about a possible Modi-Xi meeting on the sidelines of the Uzbekistan SCO Summit. It was widely believed that the disengagement that happened at PP-15 Hot Springs Gogra area along eastern Ladakh was a step in that direction. But over here, we did see them standing next to each other in a group photograph. But beyond that, there was no conversation, no bilateral, no handshake. So how do you see this turn of events?
Well, first, looking at it more broadly, India can expect no respite in strategic pressure from China, even as China rakes in growing profits from its lopsided trade relationship with India. China is strengthening its access with Pakistan. It's trying to weigh down India. And all that leaves India's options more constrained. Now, in this bigger picture, whether Xi Jinping and Modi met or not, the bigger picture doesn't change. But it's still possible that there may be a Modi-Xi Jinping meeting this evening because the bilaterals are still going on, and it's possible that we might be surprised with a Modi-Xi Jinping meeting. But even if it were to take place, we should remember that this won't be a meeting that is going to lead to any breakthrough. After all, Modi has met Xi Jinping how many times? 18 times. 18 times he met Xi Jinping, and yet the Chinese committed encroachments in Ladakh. They stabbed India in the back, despite Modi bending over backwards to befriend China. The first foreign leader Modi hosted after becoming prime minister was Xi Jinping. And what did Xi Jinping bring as a gift? He brought a Chinese encroachment in Ladakh in 2014. So the more India has sought to engage with China, the more China has pretended that it's engaging India while it has been working to contain India. So a Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi meeting is not going to make much of a difference to the bigger picture that India faces growing strategic pressure from China. And it has to deal with that pressure, not through showmanship, diplomatic showmanship, which is what we increasingly are focusing on. In recent years, every China-India meeting has been overhyped in India, especially by the Indian media. And yet, our troubles with China have been growing. So India needs to fundamentally change course. It has to not shy away from employing leverage where it has leverage. It should use its large market as a powerful source of leverage vis-a-vis major economies like China. It is true that India has been imbibing greater realism, yet, as you know, India remains intrinsically reactive. And without proactive diplomacy and proactive national defense,
developments at the SCO Summit and key takeaways and impact on the region. Let me go across to Ash Jain of Atlantic Council. Ash Jain, we saw several key bilaterals on the sidelines of this meeting. How would you read the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin?
Well, clearly this was Russia's attempt, Putin's attempt to show the world that Russia is not isolated. From Russia's point of view, India is an important partner. It is important for Putin to show that he has maintained global relations with important and powerful countries around the world, despite the Western sanctions and the efforts to isolate him for the war in Ukraine. And Modi, from his perspective, sees the need to continue to engage with Russia, primarily because Russia provides a cheap source of oil and energy supplies. So I think this was interesting for the two of them to have a chance to discuss greater cooperation, particularly on the energy and economic side, and to show that, at least from the Russian perspective, that they do have friends and they have partners, despite the war in Ukraine. I think it's somewhat treacherous for India in this case, because India is also under a lot of pressure from the United States and the West to distance itself from Russia. The effort is to try to penalize what Russia is doing in Ukraine by cutting off and isolating it economically and diplomatically. So Modi is taking somewhat of a risk here in terms of creating some greater tensions or discomfort in his relationship and his desire to maintain a good partnership with the West, even as he continues to stand with Putin. So it's a balancing act, and it's a challenge that India is continuing to engage in here as it tries to balance its economic interests, but also maintain and strengthen ties with the West, with the Quad, and with other countries that it needs, especially if it wants to continue to have a robust kind of defense with regard to the challenges from China.
Right. Ambassador Casey Singh, coming to Iran, we saw the Prime Minister having a bilateral with the President of Iran. There was a bilateral between Russia and Iran as well on the sidelines of this meeting. President Putin welcomed President Raisi into the SCO as well. So how do you see Iran's presence here at the SCO, the key conversations, the takeaways from the meetings?
Iran has joined SCO at this summit. And I think the Russians, the general information is that the Russians are working to ensure that the nuclear deal is not revived very quickly as far as Iran is concerned. Because was Iran to get the nuclear deal and therefore have the sanctions lifted, it may start producing and exporting more oil. It's been suffering and the sanctions may be lifted. Because the West, between Russia and Iran, today Iran is seen as a lesser evil. And therefore they would like to take the sanctions off and wean it away. And that is a way where they need the energy prices to come down with the US November midterm elections coming up. Russian attempt would be to encourage Iran not to go down that path and remain with them. Iranians, as usual, will play both sides or multiple sides. They are past masters at that. There won't be an easy solution because the Americans will have to get the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Israelis on board to really get Iranian nuclear deal resurrected. So that is the game there. But essentially at these summits, what were the leaders there for? Xi Jinping came because his zero COVID policy is leading to a slowdown of the Chinese economy. And he has next month the extremely important Communist Congress meeting where he wants the limit on the 2 terms to disappear. And he continues then forever as the leader of China. For Putin, it was important to show that he's not isolated. He's had a severe setback militarily in Kharkiv. His military is under pressure. And was he to lose Kherson, where now the pressure is building up, you may see internal changes in Russia. And that is a danger in engaging Russia at the cost of even offending the West. If tomorrow Putin doesn't stay, then all the investment you are making would not be worthwhile. And therefore, it's this balancing. And that's why the Ukraine word is not mentioned by anyone. Even India didn't bring it up, maybe not by name. When we are talking of instability and stability comes in, nobody asks why there's instability. Because the Chinese are assertive in South China Sea and they want to invade Taiwan or threatening to. And the Russians started the Ukraine war, which is what has caused the global inflation, which has caused energy prices to go up, and the food crisis, because the wheat produced by Ukraine was stuck there for many months. Nobody is asking that question. That the very guys who are now saying that we are looking for stability are the ones who are causing instability. And India is now sitting at the same table with them. So it's going to become more and more difficult for India to do this balancing.
Right.
There'll have to be some plain speaking to be done with both sides. You can't just do it with the West. You have also to do with these two gentlemen that you sit at the table with. So therefore, it's a balancing game, but which will get more complex, has already got complex, and may get more complex as we go forward.
Okay, we've run out of time, but Brahma Chellaney, Ambassador KC Singh, Ash Jain, thank you very much for joining us here on Global Eye, giving us your view on the big highlights of the SCO Summit. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.